The first presentation today dives into the theme of the road to the abolition of prostitution, and our first presenter is Jo Thompson. Jo was born and raised in the northeast of England. She is currently head of advocacy and relationships for a London-based NGO, Women at the Well. Women at the Well was developed by the Institute of Our Lady of Mercy to provide a uniquely holistic, multifaceted range of services to women who are involved with prostitution and the wider sex trade. It was built on 10 years of experience of its founder, Sister Linda Dearlove. Sister Linda had been working with women entrapped in street-based prostitution in the East End of London. The Sisters of Mercy have a history founded in working with and for women in difficult and challenging situations. Jo's role is responsible for policy, communications, fundraising, HR, and training programs, amplification of all communication strands, marketing, and all projects relating to exiting prostitution. Since an early age, Jo has shown a passion and involvement for organizations which work toward the end of violence against women, lobbying and campaigning for justice for women and girls. With a career spanning across 20 years, her focus has been on prostitution and domestic abuse. Through the Mercy Global Emerging Leaders Fellowship, Jo hopes to experience new cultures and networks while growing her leadership skills. Her ultimate aim of strengthening her skills to better equip her to work toward the abolition of prostitution. Please join me in welcoming Jo to the podium.
Good morning, and thank you very much for having me here. It's a pleasure to speak to you all, to the people here today and those online. I'm really thrilled to be here and speak to you all about a subject that I'm really passionate about, the abolition of prostitution. And today I'll be talking to you really through the lens of prostitution as violence against women and girls. My presentation will start. Work this thing today. My presentation will start by following through the following topics: the abolition of prostitution and why we need this legislation globally, language and how it affects systems and the exploitation of people, and how the Mercy Sisters have directly impacted global abolition, including highlights from my interviews with Sister Linda Dearlove and Sister Angela Reid. So why do we advocate for the abolition of the sex trade? I profoundly believe, as I've said, that prostitution is violence against women and girls, and that women can only live a free and equal life under legislation which tells us that this is wrong. Abolitionist legislation decriminalises the woman, the victim, who is entrapped in the sex trade and exploited in prostitution, and criminalises those who exploit and buy sexual access. Good examples of this legislation are France and Sweden, who've had this legislation for some time. And the framework of that we suggest that you need to go with this legislation: the legislation itself, exiting and support services, and public awareness raising. This layer of legislation and exiting support services creates a society whereby buying sexual access is seen as abhorrent, and people recognise the exploitation that the women trapped in it face. And it creates an environment where exit from the sex trade is possible. I think when I think of legislation as a whole, it really solidifies within society that something is wrong, something that, that we should move away from harmful acts. And when we look at legislation like the smoking ban, which in the UK was relatively easily came in with not a lot of fuss, really. People now, if I was to start smoking in this room, you would be horrified. You would look at you and think, what's Jo doing? Why is she, But certainly in my lifespan, people have smoked on planes, in offices, and it was such the norm. And I think what countries like France and Sweden are seeing is that there's a young generation of people coming through that think the same about prostitution. They're horrified and think it's wrong and that it's exploitative. So that's why I'm really passionate about this legislation for prostitution, because I really would love to see a day where, as a society, we all think, no, we want more for women. So in terms of language, as we know, is a very, very powerful tool. And the language that we use around exploitation and the language that's used around prostitution is very nuanced and, is very purposeful on both sides of the argument. So abolitionists like myself will use words like woman entrapped in prostitution, prostituted woman. The pro-prostitution lobby will use language such as sex worker, sex industry. And it's very purposeful in that the pro-prostitution lobby are trying to influence us all. This is a job like any other. This is a job like a teacher, or there's no difference. And that the system of exploitation is an industry. It's the same as the retail industry, that, there's no difference. So I think abolitionists and people who work in the field like myself are really passionate about, calling out that exploitation and saying that the woman is a woman exploited within a system. So, I think that's something also that I'm very passionate about, and during this project really spent some time thinking about the nuances of language, especially when you think of the UN and how, every single word in the agreed conclusions, everything is so precise, and, people in the UN can have meetings for days about one word, and quite right, because it's very important to, make sure that we're using the right language and that we're representing women and girls, and for good. So as part of my research project, I wanted to interview Sisters of Mercy who, have had a massive impact on the abolitionist movement, as many sisters and orders throughout Mercy have. The two sisters that I asked if I could interview them, and who very graciously accepted, were Sister Linda Dearlove, who I've worked with in London at Women at the Well, and Sister Angela Reid from MELF. Both of these women have been incredible mentors to me, and women that I respect enormously, and I was so thrilled that they said yes, that they would let me interview them and take time out of their very busy schedules. So I started with Linda. I met her in London. And one of the first questions I asked her was, how did the Mercy world first react to your work around abolition? Linda told me that, on the whole, the Mercy world was very open to her work and very interested in abolition of prostitution, and that her congregation supported her, and they collectively called for the issue enabling women to exit prostitution alongside change in law. That when she took her business plan to her congregation and asked, will you support me in this, I really feel like it's a calling for us to help women who are entrapped in prostitution, that they answered with yes. That during this early time and throughout, that they helped by signing letters of submission, and signing consultation responses. The building that Women at the Well was that Linda found and decided would be the best place for Women at the Well to, function from, was actually a hotel that many women in the area had been exploited in. And Linda spoke about that in detail, how it was kind of flipping the narrative of this, a place where such terrible things had happened and women had such awful experiences, to flip it to make a place where women could always come back, could be a place of family and home and hope to exit prostitution. Next, I asked about Catholic social teaching, and I asked Angela, was Catholic social teaching understood with abolition? Her answer, she explained to me that yes, it was, because Catholic social teaching is grounded in the dignity of people, and that the work that we did at Women at the Well, following on from that, was to create a resource which would really explore how prostitution interlinks with prostitution. And Linda took that resource to Rome, had it translated into Spanish and gave it to the Pope. It was given to all of the bishops in England and Wales. And I think, that was such a great piece of work, and a real, again, back to language and how the power of language and the power of influencing is so important. And Linda said we need to make information accessible and present in a way which is relatable. We then talked about the voices of women, and Linda spoke about how important it is to get women's voices magnified. She said it is critical to be a magnifier of the women's voices. And I think that during this project, I've really found that I can talk to you all as a person who's worked in the field, but what's more powerful is to have a survivor of prostitution or a woman who's experienced exploitation, and her words are going to touch people's hearts, and really, they're the real influencing tool. And it's so important that we ensure that this subject and the voices of women reach, from local to national to international policy. So thank you, Linda, very much for your time in interviewing. It's a real pleasure working alongside her, and I was very, very pleased to interview her. So next I interviewed Angela, and thank you, Angela, very much for your time. It's so important to have your voice within my research, with you being such a advocate for the abolition of prostitution. So Angela had been involved in a big piece of research in human trafficking. And when I interviewed her, she told me there are so many preconceptions about trafficking, and people have had years and years of drilling into them about prostituted women, and there are terrible connotations. And address terrible stereotypes, and it was a big leap for people to start thinking about the prostituted woman. And then this opened up looking at the dignity of people. She also talked about many grey areas and how, again, looking at the language and the issues, there's so many areas that people have lots of preconceptions about, that the research is so important to highlight those. Angela looked at language and how it can demonize, and I think that's so important, that by using a language like prostitute, and that it really does put all the emphasis onto the woman, and we're not talking about the exploitator or the person who is buying sexual access or trafficking people. We're just looking solely at the woman. And when Angela first started working with the women, she found that many of the women were trafficked as children, and that's a real experience that I found at Women at the Well as well in the UK, that many of the women we work with are trafficked, exploited as children, which, you know, is quite a shocking thing to hear, I think, and, you know, really highlights that, you know, the lack of choice often involved in prostitution. Angela told me that she wanted to address demand and also prevention. So looking at in kind of a way, looking at prostitution in a supply and demand, which, you know, as the pro-lobby would point to us and say, you know, that women are just objects which can be bought and sold. And so abolition is really breaking that down and saying, you know, looking at demand through an abolitionist lens and trying to eradicate that and stopping women being the supply. Angela talked to me, as Linda did, about the voices of women, and I think that I really can't stress enough how important the voices of women are, and the voices of women who've experienced exploitation, because it came through so strongly with talking to Linda and talking to Angela. Angela told me about the importance of women's voices and how she is passionate about getting those voices heard across the Mercy world and within the UN, as their voices tell the real story of exploitation and abuse. Next, myself and Angela talked about Catherine McCauley and how Catherine has influenced Angela's advocacy. Angela told me that Catherine had experienced a lot of loss in her life and recognised, in inverted commas, the poor. Angela's call to mercy was to recognise each person has human dignity and address the fundamental reasons for their marginalisation by putting pressure on the system. Again, when I was talking to Angela, we talked about a real emphasis on prevention, and we talked about and Angela talked about how this is something which Catherine was also passionate about. And I think, you know, that's such a theme that I've felt through this project, that Catherine McCauley's influence and the way that she worked in such a mercy-filled way with such passion and empathy is something that really follows through in all of the work of Mercy. We talked about Catholic social teaching, and Angela told me that at the core of Catholic social teaching is human dignity, and the Mercy world really understands that is the core of their work. So thank you so much, Angela, for your time. It really was a pleasure to interview you and have you as part of, you know, this resource, which I hope will go forward and people read my report and understand more about the many, many women globally who are experiencing exploitation and abuse. To finish my presentation, I would like to mention and celebrate the work of Mercy organisations across the globe who are working in this field. And I've listed them all here. And on the actual document, there's a link which you can click on to go into each of the organisations. And I really urge you to spend some time and look at these organisations and the wonderful work that they're doing across the Mercy world. You know, it's quite incredible to think of all of these really wonderful, you know, passionate women and men who are working for these organisations who are, you know, with the same goal of ending, human trafficking, prostitution and exploitation for women. So thank you very much, and it's been a pleasure talking to you today.
Thank you so much, Jo, for sharing your research and your important work ending sexual exploitation all over the world, and especially the insights into what the Mercy World is doing in this space. All right, now we get to open the floor for questions. We ask that your questions be concise and that you state your name and the country that you're from. We have a good amount of time for questions, so let's go.
Good morning. My name is Alexis Stevens from Guyana. Jo, first of all, I want to thank you for such a brilliant presentation, for helping us to understand why we need to do work around the abolition of the sex trade. My question is about the critics who will respond to what you're saying by asking, what about those women who have decided that this is their career choice? How do you respond to that?
Thank you, Alexis. And I think that's such a good question, because there will be people, and especially lots of people from the pro-lobby, the pro-prostitution lobby, who would say, prostitution is just a job like any other. And many women wake up and think, that's what I would like to do. I would like to, work as a sex worker. And I think actually myself and Angela discussed this when I was interviewing her as we were walking along to another meeting. We had a great conversation, and we were talking about how so often there's a really niche, small amount of women at the very top of society who speak for everybody. And I think that same structure is within prostitution. There are women, and I would say a small amount of women who, it's a career, it's a choice. But I want to ask us to look at the many thousands of women who it's not a choice, who it's exploitation, it's abuse. And a good friend of mine, a colleague, who's a survivor of prostitution, Rachel Moran, who's an Irish woman from Dublin. She has a quote, and she says, prostitution is a choice from no choice. And I think, that really sticks with me, that, for so many women, it really isn't. So yes, I'm within every area, there'll be some women who, I would still argue that the damage done by, somebody buying your body, the trauma would probably, in my opinion, would still be, even with those women who say it's a choice.
We have an online question. Great.
So we have a question from Winifred Doherty from Ireland, and she says, have you read the recent report of the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, which was presented at the Human Rights Council? And if so, do you have any comments to make about this report?
I do. Winifred, thank you very much. That's such an important question. And I actually had the pleasure of meeting Reem, who published this report in Montreal recently. And she gave a speech about her findings. And, I think she is such a brave and courageous woman, because she has taken on this role within the UN. And the report came on the back of the consultation, where all lots and lots of frontline organisations responded. And she spoke in Montreal about how she went into this issue with a real, she hadn't made her mind up, but on the back of hearing the voice of survivors, the voices of frontline services, she recognised prostitution as violence against women. And, that report is probably the most important piece of research and report that we've had on prostitution in this way for many, many years. And I really urge everybody to read it and use it, a quote from it, because, it's brilliant. And thank you, Winifred. That was such an important question.
Are there any more online questions or comments?
This question comes from Isabel Salter from Australia, who's wondering, what can ordinary people from the Mercy world do to advocate for the abolition of prostitution on an everyday basis? Thank you.
Thank you, Isabel. I think what we can do is challenge. We can, when people so often, at meetings and in just our general conversations with friends and colleagues, people have very rigid views often, I find, on prostitution and on prostitution and trafficking. And I've so many times people, if I had £1 for every time someone had said to me it's a job like any other, I'd be a very rich woman. And I think we have to be strong in our conviction and say no, that we don't agree, and and learn about some of the arguments and some of the myths around prostitution. And I think, it's not always the most pleasant, it can sometimes end a lovely atmosphere at a dinner party, but I think it's very important that we, hold our nerve, and like so many women before us have had, conversations that have been difficult. I'm sure Catherine had many.
We have a question in the room.
Thank you. So I'm Cynthia from Australia. Joe, I noticed in your report you spoke about about demand, basically. What kind of work can be done to do that? Are you thinking about something in schools, so it's just bringing a new language into schools and educating, or can you expand a little more on that, please?
I think the most important way we address demand is through legislation. That's the main way we can do it, because if you kind of give people free, sometimes on issues like this, I believe that you could people are not going to take the right path. They're going to be like, well, I have access to this, so I should be able to, it's my right to be able to buy sexual access. And so I think that's how we tackle demand in the biggest sense. I think you're right. Work in schools, working with young people. In the UK, myself and colleagues do some work with the Met Police, where we meet new recruits and we talk to them about a lot of what I've talked about today, about legislation, about language, about attitudes towards women. And so I think little by little, just hammering away. But I think you're right, going into schools. I've spent some time speaking in universities in the UK. I think that's so important to, even if you influence one person in the room, it's a good thing.
All right, I'm going to take up the prerogative to ask a question. Could you talk about what we can do as allies in terms of supporting survivors in the world? And maybe you can talk about what you do at Women at the Well.
Yeah, I mean, survivor voice is so important. And I think being aware that, when you speak on panels about things, to always have survivor voice there is very important. It's something we do at Women at the Well when we have we've had panels, in the UK, in the UN, and we are very passionate about making sure that on that panel there's, somebody who is speaking from lived experience. I think, you have to be very mindful that the person that you're working with is at the right stage in their life to talk about that. We don't want to become the exploiters of women. We have to be so careful of that. So working with survivors, survivor leaders, and seeking counsel from, we would really advocate for working with Space International, which is a organisation founded by a survivor, with survivor staff, survivors, everybody there is a survivor. And I think, that's really important.
Thank you. So, I think that we've learned so much from you. We've exhausted all our questions. Thank you so much, Joe.
Thank you, Chris.
And we wish you all the best in your continued advocacy and going forward as a MELF Fellow.
Thank you
And
so much.
please, we will reconvene at 1:45 for the next presentation. Please join me in congratulating Joe for her research.